This is the first episode of Primary School, a podcast about New York's 2025 mayoral primary, focused on the issues that matter most to students and young voters. I'm Eli Miller. I'm 26 years old, I'm a lifelong New Yorker, and a huge fan of oversized chocolate chip cookies, the music of Taylor Swift, the New York Yankees, and of nerdy and obsessional politics coverage. I've worked as a data researcher in criminal justice reform for the past 4 years, and in my free time, I've written a blog about ghosts called Ghost Runner. You should go check it out. And now, I'm starting a new project with some friends. Our guest today, Ross Barkan, has been writing about New York City politics for more than a decade. He's covered the last 3 mayoral elections very closely, both in outlets like the New York Times, New York Magazine, The Village Voice, Gothamist, and his personal Substack, Political Currents. But he's also a true polymath. He covers national politics, he covers pop culture, literary fiction, and he's written multiple fiction and nonfiction books, including a new novel out this spring. And he even ran for state senate in Brooklyn in 2018, when he hired a young Zohran Mamdani to manage his campaign. We get into Zohran, Cuomo, Adrian Adams, and some of the inside baseball on how to cover a mayoral race and what sorts of things do and don't matter. I'm so excited to share my conversation with Ross Barkan. All right, Ross Barkan, thank you so much for being here on Primary School.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Happy to be here to chat a bit.
Amazing. I want to start by if you could tell us a little bit about your experience covering New York City elections, specifically mayoral elections for the past, coming on 10 years. You covered the 2013 election really closely. You covered the 2021 election really closely. What are some things as a reporter that you're looking for? What are the shiny objects that you think people overrate? And what's the stuff that actually matters?
That's a really good question. So yeah, I started writing about the mayoral politics in 2013. It was young reporters, really my first experience to electoral politics up close. So it was really, really fascinating learning experience. I mean, it in terms of the shiny objects, it's getting harder and harder to know what an endorsement means, and everyone has an idea of what it means and what this elected official does or this union does. And the reality is, you want endorsements, they're good, they're net positives, not net negatives. They can bring some volunteers, some interest, some fundraising. Some are genuinely bigger than others. Some, if they are large unions that with a track record of being in electoral politics, can really help. But at the same time, we're entering an era politically where voters are not taking their cues as much from institutional forces. And so a single endorsement's not going to move the needle perhaps like it once did. Now, there are some like the New York Times editorial board, which are prized quite a bit and seem to have mattered a lot in 2021. There's a feeling that if they decide to endorse again, that will impact this race as well. So that's possible. But even there, you've got about 1 million Democrats who will come to vote in this primary. A majority of them are not taking their cues from one newspaper editorial board, even the New York Times is. So we're in a world where it's not so easy to map on an impact of a group makes an endorsement, then these number of votes show up. What does matter still? I mean, certainly fundraising matters. There's a generous public matching fund system in New York City elections where donations up to $250 can be matched by taxpayer money up to 8 times. So it incentivizes small dollar giving because then that can unlock a lot more money. And to be competitive, you have to really qualify for this system. And so right now, there are 4 who have qualified. There are 2 others who are going to or will soon. Andrew Cuomo being one of them, and Adrian Adams, the council speaker, who should at some point as well. So fundraising still matters. If you don't have the money, you can't go on TV. You can't have a big field operation. You can't reach voters. Again, it's a very big electorate. People just forget how many voters there are in New York City, how diverse it is, how many different groups to reach. So you need money.
So money and endorsements, super important. So and we'll put this in the show notes, I actually just came out with an endorsements tracker, so it's really great to hear you immediately start talking about endorsements. I'm wondering, one thing that jumped out at me though, and I'm sort of spoiling a Zoran question I was going to ask you later, how much does social media following matter right now? Because like I was clicking through, and especially like some of the like Democratic clubs that were doing endorsements, and these are like old institutions, the West Side Democrats, and they have like 500 Twitter followers or something like that. And then I was looking at the NYC DSA account that endorsed Zoran very enthusiastically. That's got like, I don't have the exact number in front of me, but like tens of thousands or maybe even more. It's a massive, massive account. I think obviously in my circles as like a, 20 something in New York City, like I think a lot of people overrate social media, but like, does that matter at all? Like how do you weight that? How do you think about that?
It is easy to overrate it. I think where it can matter is with a candidate like Zoran in building buzz and attracting attention and attracting money and volunteers. So I think Zoran has used social media plainly better than the rest of the candidates, and he now is polling competitively with some of them, and he's raised a lot of money. So that is where social media does matter. If you are good at social media, if you have a compelling message, if you're clever, if you're appealing, you can rise. You see this happen in national politics with Bernie Sanders. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, when she ran against Joe Crowley, had a very strong social media strategy, and she was getting noticed online far before legacy media took an interest in her race. And it's always a bonus. It's always good to be stronger at this because you are reaching real people. Now, of course, it's far from everything. And DSA matters, but their reach also is limited for now to certain neighborhoods. So there are places where having that large following won't matter a bit. And there are candidates that will have poor social media that will end up performing well in this race. It's a very big electorate. You have, I wouldn't call it an older electorate or a younger electorate. It's just mixed. You've got a lot of homeowners and longtime voters and people who've been in elections for 30 years. You have now a young professional class that's really becoming a voting force. That's been a real change in New York politics that I think not enough people have taken note of. There's still this outdated notion that the hipster, the gentrifier is transient and that they don't show up in these sorts of elections. And I think that was true maybe in the 2010s. It's less true now. And you could see it in the 2021 election where neighborhoods in Western Queens and Northern Brooklyn that gentrified a lot over the last 10 years have now high voter turnout. I mean, they just, the raw numbers are high. And those kinds of voters are noticing Zoran on social media. I mean, there's no doubt he has a base now, and that base will show up for him. The question for him, as it is for a lot of candidates in this race, can you build a broad coalition to win? Someone like Cuomo, he's got the makings of a broad coalition. Can he overcome the segment of the electorate that won't put him on their ballot at all? And then the sort of budding don't rank Cuomo movement, maybe he can. We're going to find out. It's March. You know, I think with endorsements, too, it's tricky. A lot of it's truthfully folk wisdom. What unions do bring is money and resources. And those things, of course, are very relevant. Nice things that unions will do for you, they can save you a lot of money, which is something that outsiders don't always realize. If you get a union endorsement, they're doing work on your behalf, and you don't have to pay for it. So they can run a canvassing operation. They can go knock on doors. They can do digital ads. They can fund a TV ad campaign if they want to. And these are things that won't come out of your pocketbook. So, you know, with endorsements, you're able to consolidate a bunch of them. That's very helpful. I think what's interesting with your endorsement tracker is looking at Cuomo. I think in sheer number, it looks good. It's still a bit shallow right now. I think if I were evaluating the Cuomo rollout, I would say for an ex-governor who's in office for over a decade and is polling ahead of the field by 20 points, if you took those data points in a vacuum, right, you would think they're coming in with like most major unions in the city, most major sitting elected officials, and this is kind of a fait accompli. It's not quite that way. I think Cuomo's trying to make it seem that way, and he is slowly rolling up support. There's no doubt about it. But I think, as you found too, the vast majority of unions and elected officials are in play. They've endorsed no one. And that's a recognition that Cuomo is a front runner, but he's flawed. And like a lot of politicians are waiting to see where the race is in 2 months from now. I see slowly, Asian, Black, elected officials, Hispanic, like there's a coalition coming together, but still for someone who, dominated the state for 11 years.
He's definitely not all the way there. So I want to, this is a good transition to ask you about Cuomo. You're a polymath. You write about national politics. You write about local politics. You write about things that have nothing to do with politics, like fiction and culture. And but if you're an expert in anything, it's Andrew Cuomo. This is your bread and butter.
These certain men in my life, Cuomo, Eric Adams, and Donald Trump, you can't lose them.
And what men you've chosen, or that have chosen you. So I want to ask you, and specifically with the frame, I know a lot of people have an impression of Cuomo as, he was a Democratic governor during a really difficult time, and he galvanized us with all these amazing press conferences, and he was just sort of always around and had this weird sort of, he was not exactly charismatic, but like there was a charm. I think people feel sort of a vague fondness and a lot of fuzziness around the details. So why, if you are a loyal MSNBC watching Democrat, might you not want to support Andrew Cuomo?
Yeah, so there's a few things. So pre-pandemic, for much of his tenure, Andrew Cuomo was a centrist to even, I would say, conservative Democratic governor who actively helped Republicans control the state Senate. That's kind of like a fundamental fact of his governorship until 2019. Democrats could not get the majority in the state Senate because Cuomo basically undercut them and helped a breakaway conservative faction of Democrats power share with the Republicans, and he refused to help Senate Democrats in their various bids to take the majority. In most states, the governor is very actively invested in party building. Andrew Cuomo let the Democratic Party apparatus in New York State completely rot away. There really was no Democratic Party. It was an Andrew Cuomo slush fund. He not helped members of Congress. He not helped state legislative candidates. It was about Cuomo. It's about consolidating power for himself. That's how he governed. He was the opposite of a Democratic Party team player. So I think for those who are into MSNBC or into Team Blue winning, Andrew Cuomo is not about Team Blue. It was never, ever his interest. And you could find, lots of grumbling from many Democratic politicians across the 2010s who were frustrated with him, in essence, enabling Republican power in the state. So you start there. Then we can jump to COVID and his COVID failures, and they kind of fall into several buckets, some that are pretty well known, some that are less well known. So one thing that's not well known is that Andrew Cuomo directly delayed a lockdown order for New York City that probably could have saved lives. How many lives? There are different debates. There's a Columbia study that said New York delaying a lockdown by several days may have killed tens of thousands of people. It's an inexact science. So I'm not going to say Cuomo has this sort of blood in his hands for doing this. I'll simply just say that in March, around this time 5 years ago, COVID had arrived. We were realizing this is going to be a severe problem for millions of people. This is a catastrophe. Andrew Cuomo had spent much of February, like Donald Trump, comparing COVID to the flu. You can go back and find old transcripts. I wrote about that in my book, which published a few years ago, The Prince. Once it becomes clear a lockdown is needed, at least initially, Bill de Blasio proposes one. Cuomo says no. He's the governor. He has the power to do it, overrules him, and several days later turns around and then imposes one on his terms. And so in those several days, the virus is spreading unchecked. And again, this part of the history is forgotten. And if you look back on it, the only conclusion you can really come to is that Cuomo did it because of ego. They did not want the mayor of New York City getting out ahead of him, making a declaration or an order that he himself didn't first conceive of. So Cuomo does it. He does it on his own terms a few days later. Then we get to the more well-known stuff, which has certainly become a cause on the right, but I think any New Yorker should care. The first is the fact that Cuomo masked the death toll in nursing homes. The data was toyed with. So if a nursing home resident got sick with COVID and they were transferred to a hospital and died in a hospital, which a lot of people do die in hospitals, it does not count toward the nursing home death total, which was very strange. This was not the way any other state counted deaths in nursing homes. Like, oh, you were a nursing home resident and you died of COVID. Well, there you go. So Cuomo, because he was becoming a national hero, he did not want the narrative of COVID spreading unchecked in nursing home facilities, pushed his health commissioner, Howard Zucker, to create this very strange formula for counting nursing home deaths. This was all detailed in a report by Tish James, the attorney general, so I'm not making this
They
up.
admitted it. Melissa DeRosa, his chief aide, said to a reporter, "We were worried that Trump would use this against us."
Yes. So this is not a right-wing conspiracy theory for my liberals out there. This very much happened. The other big policy problem was they were very quick to discharge COVID-infected nursing home patients who are in hospitals back into nursing homes rather than putting them into other makeshift facilities. The city had actually built out a lot of excess capacity at the Javits Center and elsewhere where they could have brought COVID patients to isolate them. Instead, Cuomo and the state, for reasons that still aren't entirely clear to this day, to be honest with you, took these COVID patients who were in the hospital, shoving them back into nursing homes, which very likely contributed to further spread. And I would say the other damning part of his pandemic record, beyond delaying it, beyond downplaying it, beyond manipulating data, is the pandemic memoir. I think if you're one who wants to be sympathetic to the nursing home scandal, which one can, it was a very chaotic time. I don't agree with those who defend Cuomo, but I can see why you might. You can say, well, where else were they going to go? What else were they going to do with the data? Blah, blah, blah. But this was quite egregious. Andrew Cuomo is in the midst of presiding over mass death in his state, and a publisher is paying him $5 million so he can write a memoir in 2020, again, as people are dying, on his wonderful leadership. And he's actually using state resources to put this book together. He has his own staff working on it. So you think of the type of person who is governing the state through the worst crisis it's seen in a century, maybe longer, and your focus is not on governing and comforting people. It's on cashing out and writing a book. I love books. I write books. If I were the governor of the state, I would not be cutting a book deal for myself 2 months into the pandemic to do a memoir. So that's something that is now like more widely known. I think there's a lot of voters who don't quite still know that part of it. And if you look at polling, it's one of those things that when you tell people, they become quite turned off. And because I think it's more clear cut, and you can't make sort of the fog of war arguments that you can for a lot of COVID policy. And I think it's true. Very hard time to govern. Mistakes were made throughout the country. This was very craven.
Right.
There are no other governors sitting in the states getting book deals, doing memoirs. Again, in the midst of all of this carnage, it would be craven if you did it 2 or 3 years later, but it would be a bit better. You wait a little bit, you get your state through crisis, then you want to cash out. Still wrong, but you're cashing out in the height of a true catastrophe.
And you're not using state resources to do it. And I mean,
don't use don't use your staffers to help write it.
So with this in mind, I'm wondering, just because if what you just said could be recorded as an attack ad for Lander, for Zellner-Myrie, or one of the other candidates. So far, it seems like the candidates they obviously knew he was entering the race. They have been very prepared. They had, the day he announced, they had all their hits out. They seem to be following a few different themes. Lander's really been hammering the legal fees on the sexual harassment, but also the fact that taxpayers are paying to defend him on those. He's also has this catchphrase, we don't want to trade one corrupt chaos agent with another, which is trying to equate him with Eric Adams, who's very unpopular. Zoran's been trying to equate him with Trump. He filmed a video in front of Trump Tower comparing their records of both the sexual harassment, the tax cuts for rich people, and the austerity members, the cuts to Medicaid, et cetera. So that's sort of the like, you are equivalent to Trump, you're not strong on Trump. He mocked him for his weak statement on various other Trump overreaches in New York City. There's a lot of ammo to work with for all these candidates. My impression is both of those attacks, I think they're finding some traction, but so far they're not completely bursting through. I'm wondering, do you think there's more meat on the table? Do you think they should change course? Do you think there's another candidate who's one thing that occurs to me is that Jessica Ramos, who's from the area of Queens that was the epicenter of the epicenter and lives right by Elmhurst Hospital, she's someone who is perfectly qualified to hammer some of this COVID stuff if she wants to. Do you see that happening? Is this all futile? How do you see this unfolding?
Ramos is a good example of someone who would be a very strong candidate, but because she's not qualified for matching funds, it's going to be very hard for her to break through. So I agree with you. She's a strong messenger. She's charismatic. She's been a Cuomo critic for years. She's well positioned in that way. Does she have the money to do it? Realistically, she's not qualified. Doesn't seem to be that close. Going to be hard for her to put a campaign together and be in a position to do that. But to your other questions, we're going to see. I would say it's early. We're recording this in March. The primary is the end of June. If you look at these races, they really start to take shape in the spring when voters are paying closer attention. Most Democrats are not thinking too hard about the mayoral race beyond the fact that Eric Adams is in trouble and Andrew Cuomo showed up. It's not front of mind for them. So we're going to know more in the spring. I'd say by April and May, that's where the polling starts to become more meaningful. That's where you look for trends. That's where you see if attacks are breaking through. Something I would say with Cuomo, I think what's going to matter is whether any of the candidates or the super PAC that's opposing him, can they cut a very compelling and devastating attack ad that in 30 seconds encapsulates some of this? And maybe it's a COVID ad. Tough attack ads that are well written can do a lot of damage. So I'm curious to see if that sort of attack ad will emerge. Also, collective criticism over time can take a toll. In 2021, Andrew Yang was the front runner for many months. He was the focus of basically all of the scrutiny, all of the attacks from various candidates, and his favorability slowly eroded. And I think Cuomo is stronger than Yang. I think his opponents have to work harder. At the same time, what does Cuomo look like after 2 months of attacks and 2 months of negative coverage and advertisements running on TV and in the digital space on his record? If Cuomo survives all of it, if his polling isn't changing very much, you'd say he's durable and he's going to win. If he's sitting here on June 1st and he's got, a 20-point lead in the polls, that's serious. You can't argue with that. Of course, we haven't talked about yet the wild card here is ranked choice voting. This is our second mayoral primary with RCV. Anyone who can tell you exactly what's going to happen with this election with RCV is lying to you. And everyone has their own theories, and it's not easy to map out. So Eric Adams, if you look at the 2021 first place votes on election night, Eric Adams had around 30% of the vote. If I recall, Catherine Garcia was like a full 10 points behind him, which is a lot. Maya Wiley was slightly ahead of her. I want to say around 22, can fact check it. It was around 30, 31, 22. And then maybe Garcia was sitting around 20. So if you took that split, right, on primary night, you go Eric Adams won the race going away. Like in a normal election, if you're up by 10 points on election night, you win. With RCV, Garcia had been very good about showing up on a lot of different ballots. She had cross-endorsed with Andrew Yang in the last few days of the campaign, which seemed to boost her in Asian communities in some places where Yang was popular. And so suddenly, as candidates were eliminated, Garcia kept moving up and up and up to the point where in the final round, she was within 10,000 votes of becoming mayor. And, one of the great what ifs in local political history, what if Garcia had won? But my main point is RCV is somewhat unpredictable, and it's going to reward the broad coalition building. So take someone like Cuomo. There are very easy arguments to make for him that are pro and anti when it comes to RCV. I think I'd say that the pro argument is Cuomo is very well known. He's already clearly gaining support in the Asian community. He's going to have support in the Black community. He should do well with Orthodox Jews. He should do well with some left-leaning white voters. That's like a decent number of ballots. He's going to be in a lot of different neighborhoods. That is good for RCV. And I would say the con is that there's going to be a very concerted movement to tell voters not to rank Andrew Cuomo.
For sure. We're going to do a longer explainer on this because it's something that I think our audience needs to understand. And is I think a lot of people have this image of this spooky computer where you put your vote in and then the computer sort of mixes it up based on an algorithm. It's a much more straightforward process. They're just, in one sentence, the way it works is that if your first place person doesn't get enough votes to move on to the next round, your vote goes to your second place person. So who you rank second, who you rank third matters a lot. We'll get into more details and mechanics of the 2021 election at a later episode. But I think this is a good way to get into the next person I want to talk about, Adrienne Adams, the current city speaker, who we've both written blogs about in the past 2 weeks. And the reason that I think she's super fascinating is that I think that she is the only candidate who there are people today who are like dead, and maybe not people, but like large groups of people, large like neighborhoods, demographics of people who right now are on Team Cuomo and actually like could decide to leave that team and go to someone else. I think that they'd go to Adrienne Adams. I think that the key for her and for the scenario you just outlined is, can Adrienne Adams convince people not only to vote for her, but to vote for her and not rank Cuomo, and to rank to put an Adrienne Adams Brad Lander ballot or an Adrienne Adams Zellner Myrie ballot. So can you tell us a little bit about how she might go about doing that? Also, just like, who is she? I think her name recognition is pretty low. And what's going to be the shape of her campaign, and how's she going to go about trying to do that?
So, Adrienne Adams, she's a city council speaker. She was elected in a bit of surprise in the speakership vote, which is an internal vote among city council members in 2021. She has been a forceful but low-profile speaker, so forceful in that she's overridden multiple Eric Adams vetoes, which is something that did not happen in prior speakerships. But her media profile is lower than, I'd say, at least the prior two speakers, Corey Johnson and Lissa Mark-Viverito, who attracted a lot more press attention and were rumored candidates for higher office. Adrienne Adams seemed to have no plans to run for higher office, and as recently as a few months ago was going to quietly end her political career. She's an unassuming person. She is charismatic, but again, she's not someone who really sought out attention and profile building. She doesn't have a signature issue or something that the public imagination would associate her with. But Eric Adams' deep vulnerabilities and also Andrew Cuomo's entrance into the race really prompted her to decide at the last minute to enter the primary. She's the sort of candidate where, had she started in October, she'd be in a very strong position right now. So she's from Southeast Queens, so it's a Black middle-class part of the city. Very reliable Democratic voters. This is a area that both Cuomo and Eric Adams are going to fight over. Politically moderate, but also staunchly Democrat. And Adams certainly has the ability, Adrienne Adams, to finish first in these areas. And can she talk them into not putting Cuomo on their ballots at all? That's going to be harder. I don't know if she can do that. I think it's possible she can start to undercut Cuomo and finish first in some of the neighborhoods where he's competitive. Now, her challenge is name recognition. Cuomo is very well known. She is not. Her challenge is money. She just announced she had a very quick, nice fundraising haul, but she missed the deadline to qualify for a tranche of matching funds that would come in the spring. She can certainly get them later on, but it puts you at a disadvantage. There are 4 candidates now who have multiple millions in the bank, plus Cuomo. So, plus Eric Adams, who still has multiple millions. So she's behind in the money race, right? to do well and possibly win, I think a few things have to happen for Adrienne Adams. One, she's got to raise money very quickly. She's got to show her supporters, a lot of these elected officials and labor unions, that she's serious. She's a candidate who's going to benefit from endorsements. Now, like we talked about before, there's no magic formula for endorsements. There's no like this one person delivers this number of votes, unless you're talking Hasidic rabbis, really no one else. But if you accumulate a lot of them, it can help you potentially attract votes and attract more money. It kind of becomes this momentum, this ball rolling downhill. So if Adrienne Adams can be the candidate of large labor unions, that's a big advantage over Cuomo. If she finds a way to get endorsed by like 32BJ, 1199, UFT, Hotel Trades Council, some combo of that. If she's taking like 2 out of 4, 3 out of 4, that's a big deal. It's a lot of money. It's a lot of resources. If she can do something like get the endorsement of the New York Times editorial board, the New York Times said they were not endorsing in this race and then recently indicated they might be back in the endorsement game where they were for decades. If she's the type, if the Times comes out and says rank Adams 1, Adrienne Adams 1, and she's got that going for her. She's got labor going for her. She's raising money. She's serious and she can win. You start to see a version of what Wiley and Garcia were doing, but potentially more institutional support. Again, the issue is she waited a very long time. Another problem was Tish James. Tish James was flirting with running for mayor, would have been a very strong candidate if she did it, decided not to do it. Instead, she's tacitly backing Adrienne Adams. And Tish James is a much stronger candidate than Adrienne Adams. And so her waffling, Adams herself not being hungry to run, just put her behind. She's behind. She's behind the other candidates right now. Can she catch up? The answer is yes, but that's a challenge that the others aren't facing.
Yeah, and I mean, quickly on that, Tish James, if you're listening, big fan, good job with some of the stuff you're doing. Please endorse Adrienne Adams tomorrow. Like, that would be great. If you're like, the tacit endorsement, I think is not super helpful. Most people don't read the tea leaves the way that Ross does.
I assume at some point she might. I'm guessing she's also attorney general, though. She does endorse. I mean, it's a weird thing when you're in a law enforcement role, but you can still endorse candidates. So I assume she will at some point endorse. That's my guess. I would guess she will do something formal later on.
Well,
but yeah, it would help. To do it formally is always more helpful.
Okay, so moving to the opposite side of the proverbial political spectrum, I want to ask you about Zohran. So Zohran Mamdani, state assembly member from Astoria. You have a personal connection with him. He ran your campaign for state senate in 2018. I don't have a personal connection with him except that we went to the same K-8 school and I believe overlapped for 2 years when I was like 5 and 6 and he was much older.
Yeah.
But I feel some affinity to him for that. The way I want to frame this for you is I think in a lot of sort of DSA, Bernie circles, there's a feeling of like end of history inevitability with a lot of socialist politics. And like what we're saying is obvious. It is true that people need to support these common sense policies that exist all over the country. I mean, not all over the country, all over the world, not all over the country. But inevitably, people will wake up to this. And if we just do a really good job organizing and we keep fighting, corporate power and capitalism will eventually bend to our will. I guess my question is, since that hasn't happened yet, and since, I mean, obviously there are pockets, is that inevitability argument, is that true? And the reason it hasn't happened yet is just because it's a very difficult lift? Or is there something that argument is missing about maybe specifically the composition of New York City that imposes sort of a hard ceiling on Zohran's chances?
The answer is we don't know. I think nothing is inevitable in politics or life. So I don't endorse any argument that says a certain policy outcome or a certain political movement must inevitably succeed. We don't know. The future is unpredictable. The reality is if you want to make change happen, you've got to work towards it. You got to put in the organizing, put in the effort, and make it happen. Is there a hard cap? I mean, this is a question I think about a lot, right? With Zoran right now, my sense is there probably is some cap, but we don't know what that is. Now, is Zoran likely to win? I'd say as of today, no. I think like likely implies that he's the favorite in the field right now, and he's not. Just realistically, is Zoran running very well? Yes. Is Zoran doing everything one could do in this position to succeed? The answer is yes. This has been an extremely well executed campaign from the point of messaging, from the point of the principle, from the point of strategy, from the point of fundraising. Everything you want to do, he's doing. So he's put himself in a very strong position. And he's got a base. In these kinds of races, you have to have a base. You got to have a place where you know on election day there's going to be a big turnout for you. That's a problem for Zellner Myrie. We haven't talked about him too much. Zellner has had a good fundraising push throughout the primary. He's got real attributes. He's Afro-Latino in a city where those are two very important constituencies. He has charisma. He's got a record in the state legislature. Hasn't quite caught on in the same way. Not in the way Zoran has. And I think one question for Zellner is, well, what's his base, right? Well, he's got a state Senate district that includes Park Slope and central Brooklyn that has a lot of professional class white and black voters. Are these all automatic votes for Zellner? I don't know. I can tell you in Zoran's assembly district, those are automatic votes for him. I can tell you in Greenpoint and parts of Williamsburg, parts of Bushwick, parts of Long Island City, parts of Sunnyside, and so on, Zoran is going to finish in first, and there's very little question about that. So that is a real strength. And the question for Zoran, as is a question for Brad Lander, to be fair, and others, can you build out the broad coalition? Can Zoran, who's a proud socialist and anti-Zionist, win over voters who are pro-Israel, who are left of center but don't support the pro-Palestine movement? Can those people be won over? What about Asian voters who care mostly about crime and about keeping the specialized tests at the public high schools like Brooklyn Tech and Bronx High School Science, where Zoran actually went? Can you talk to those voters? I don't know. Maybe not. Middle class black voters. Some homeowners. Some who are not predispositioned to supporting insurgents. I would say. Certainly not socialists, not insurgents. Can he make inroads there? So there's all these questions, right? How do you get to 50%? How do you build a broad coalition? I don't subscribe to any sort of hard rule or inevitability. I don't think it's inevitable socialism wins. I don't think it's inevitable that it loses. I think there's probably a cap on Zoran's support. But what is the cap? No one really knows. You're going to have to see how the polls play out. Is there a cap on Cuomo's support? Probably yes. Is there a cap on Brad Landers and Scott Stringer's? I think Zoran does face these ideological challenges. He's going to have to go into certain communities, and if he's pressed on DSA's position on defunding the police, he's got to have an answer, because defunding the police is not popular. Now, Zoran has been very smart in this campaign, running on cost of living issues, running on economics. He's doing exactly what you'd want a leftist to do. But the policing question is there, and DSA is very open about wanting to cut the department's budget in half. DSA supports open borders. They don't believe in traditional immigration laws. That's a fine position to take. It's one that is not popular in New York City, especially coming off the migrant crisis. That's something else he might have to answer for and have to talk about. He knows this. He's very bright, and he's going to have answers. But these are all factors that come into play. But he's doing extremely well, especially considering he's a state assemblyman who has only been in office since 2021 and is only 33 years old. He's raised a ton of money, and his name recognition has shot up. Talk about what Adrian Adams must do. Zoran did it. No one knew who Zoran was in October other than me and you, and really inside baseball, people. Now you say the name Zoran to politically aware New Yorker, they know who he is, and that's hard to do. He did it very quickly.
Okay, so I want to briefly, I mean, there's more candidates that we could go one by one with. You mentioned Bradlander and Zellner. We should talk for half an hour about each one. But I want to pivot a little bit to zooming out. New York City is in a tough spot right now. The country is in a tough spot right now. Most recently, the detainment of Mahmoud Khalil is something that I think has just been really shocking and upsetting to a lot of New Yorkers. I've noticed that your response to this, you wrote a New York Magazine article with the headline, "The detainment of Mahmoud Khalil will backfire on Trump." This is not the vibe I get in the rest of stuff that I read. And so obviously I hope you're right. And I want to probe it a little bit. So first of all, I'd love it if you could just give a brief version of that argument. And second of all, I think that argument in the article is based a lot on public opinion. People don't really like incursions into free speech. People don't like police overreach. And I guess I'm wondering what you rate the chances of public opinion not really mattering. Like, and one way to probe that is like, will the next mayor of New York City, if they're not, say, like Cuomo or Adams, will that person get federally indicted at some point?
Anything's possible, right? I have no idea. Could they get indicted in a politically trumped up case? Maybe. Anything's possible. I would say, yeah, public opinion not mattering. Certainly, Trump will continue to be president regardless of public opinion until 2028, unless he dies or becomes incapacitated. So, yeah, there's no doubt that the Republican Party can become less popular in these next few years, and Trump will become less popular inevitably, but that is cold comfort for those who have to live with Trump. So that's something I'm very aware of and sympathetic to. I think something to keep in mind is, as you said at the top, this is not something a majority of Americans are excited about. I compare it to the war on terror, where what Bush was doing in his violations of civil liberties was, in my view, quite disturbing and of a degree that we've not yet even seen out of Trump. But post 9/11, there's a lot of political buy-in for this type of quasi-fascism, or whatever you want to call it, real trampling on civil liberties. And this was the war on terror era. This is when Bush was very popular. This was when jingoism was at its height. This was when support for the Iraq War was incredibly widespread. And to be against it was to be in this very alienated minority and to face a real cancellation threat that has mostly been forgotten now. And that is one difference, where Trump and his supporters are fighting for a cause that is not that important to most Americans. I'm talking about the cause of Israel and Zionism. And I'm Jewish, so I know these issues fairly well. Most polls show Americans are more supportive of Israel in the abstract than Palestinians. I think that's true. I think younger generations are becoming more pro-Palestine. That will continue. But you can't argue that, like, anti-Zionism is popular. It's not. You can't argue that Americans want to see Israel destroyed. They don't. But what you can say is that most Americans who think about the issue support Israel moderately, but would like a state for the Palestinians, and aren't incensed enough about it to back the federal government arresting a legal resident for nothing other than protesting. And it's a dark turn in this Trump era, and it's one that can very well continue regardless of public opinion. So I want to say my point about public opinion is more of a long-term view than in the short term, Trump's going to be Trump. But in the long term, I am fairly bullish on Democratic Party prospects for, 26, 28. I think, yes, it's true the party is currently in a bit of a disarray. I think it finds itself in a place not so different than it did in 2005, losing a popular vote to a Republican president and feeling lost. American politics is cyclical. And also, I think the 2028 primary will be competitive, which is something Democrats really need. And the reality is either Trump is going to try to be the true fascist dictator people says he is and seize power and try to hold it through 2028 at age 82 and subdue the military and subdue all the deep state agencies and wield power like a Putin or a Xi, and I think that's very unlikely. But you put it there as a scenario. I'd say the more likely outcome is J.D. Vance is the nominee, maybe a different Republican, but we'll say Vance is the VP, and he's got to go fight it out in an election where I don't know if he's the favorite. I'm not sure. We're a long ways from there. I'm thinking longer term, but in the short term, it's quite bad. I don't want to undersell it. That's where we find ourselves.
Well, the long-term focus is definitely, if nothing else, appreciated in the bleak moment that you're describing. Really quickly, 2 lightning round questions. First one, do you think New York City will have a larger population or a smaller population in 10 years than it does right now?
I'd say slightly larger.
Nice. Awesome. And 2, where should people be getting their local news besides just like the New York Times? What are some indispensable resources that you rely on?
I think Politico is really good. Their playbook, their New York playbook is very extensive. City and State's very good. They've got a morning read. The City, the nonprofit news outlet, they do a lot of strong reporting. If you follow New York State and Albany, New York Focus, another new nonprofit, is quite good. I do think you should read the New York Post. I think the New York Post is one window into New York City, so it's worth being aware of it. And I try to consume what they do. I'm sure I'm leaving Hellgate, another new nonprofit. They're punchy, kind of from the left, and they're a lot of fun. They do investigative reporting as well. So Hellgate. I say I shouldn't leave out an underrated one is Gothamist, which has also a very good morning newsletter, a very well-produced newsletter. They've got a lot of good veteran reporters, since WNYC owns them, so they have a nice synergy with their radio reporters, and their radio reporters write as well. So I like Gothamist. I think Gothamist is an underrated one. So those are like the top ahead ones. I'm sure I'm forgetting people, and I'll hear complaints later on.
That's a great list. I would add Political Currents by Ross Barkan. It's a great Substack.
Add my stuff. Yeah, I know my stuff. You want to get mayoral gossip. I enjoy doing. I'm to do more of it too, since the race is heating up. Definitely will be. There's been a Zoran piece I've been kicking around, so gonna return to him soon.
Amazing. Well, looking forward to that. And last thing, in addition to covering the race and covering national politics, you also have a novel out in the spring. Just give us a quick picture of what that is and what we should expect.
Yeah, it's called Glass Century. You should order it now. It's out May 6th. It's a big New York social novel. So if you like ambitious books with plots and characters and are very narrative driven, you like love stories, and you like a tale of New York City from the 1970s to 2020, this is for you. And there is a certain cameo from a certain future president in the 1970s. You can probably guess who that future president is. Not a big part of the book, but it's in there, and it's a little fun twist. So I would say if you're interested in social novels and family sagas and politics, it's a book for you. So order it now.
Amazing. Already pre-ordered. I'm super psyched. And I would also just say, if you are interested in New York City politics and Cuomo specifically, you should really go check out The Prince, Ross's last book. The Prince it's one of these books where the way I was describing it to someone is, if you go back to a high school reunion and you're talking to someone who, you remembered as being like the coolest kid in the school, maybe like the girl you had a crush on, and then she is like, oh, like, I always thought you were like, but you like, in your mind, she would never have talked to you. And then she goes up to you and she's like, oh, I remember you were always like the cutest person there or something. And it's just like, what? Like, what are you talking about? This completely upends 10 years of like storytelling in my mind. Obviously, the nouns and adjectives are different. Cuomo is not someone that a girl you had a crush on, but the feeling of like, this happened? Are you serious? This thing that I lived through and then had a whole like mythology in my mind about was exactly the opposite of what I thought it was. It's just like the book is full of tons of experiences like that. So I really recommend it. The Prince by Ross Barkan, and everyone should read it so that they don't vote for Cuomo. Ross, thank you so much for coming on this podcast. I really appreciate it, and I'm looking forward to your coverage as we go on.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Great to be here.
Thanks so much for listening to my conversation with Ross Barkan. It was produced by Oliver Heller, Lucy Ackman, Sean Heaney, and Jonathan Jalbert. Edited by Sean and Jonathan. Sean also recorded the music that you're hearing right now. Our cover art was by Charlotte Heller. On our next episode, we have our first interview with an actual candidate, so stay tuned for that sometime in the next coming days. In the meantime, you can follow us at Primary School NYC on Instagram and probably on other social media platforms soon. Our YouTube channel is called Primary School Podcast, and you can listen to us there or wherever else you listen to podcasts. Thanks so much for listening. The election is on June 24th.